Tēnā koutou, kua hui hui mai I tēnei pō, me tīmata tātou I te karakia. E rongo, ko te rongo a whare, ko te rongo a marae, ko te rongo a te hā, ko te rongo mai whiti, kia hau mai ko te rongo, ko te mau ngā rongo, ko te rongo mau. E rongo, whakairia ki runga, kia tīna. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Nau mai whakatau mai ki te papa tongarewa. Ki runga o rongo marairoa, ki raro I te tuanui o tō tātou whare, a te hono ki hoaki. Tēnā koutou e te paipai kōrero, kua tau mai. Ki te whakawhiti kōrero e pā ana ki te Huringa Āhuarangi. Nau mai, tauti mai, tēnā koutou katoa. I have a couple health and safety. If you need the wharepaku, it's just over there. Also, if you could turn your phones on silent, that would be lovely. Feel free to take photos, just with no flash. And in case of an emergency, please follow our lovely visitor services hosts, and they'll take us out of the whare. So, kia ora and enjoy.
Kia ora everyone, my name is Kate. I'm going to be the host of this panel discussion. So this is the third panel in this series. This one has been made possible with the kind support of Toka Tu Ake EQC. So first of all, let me introduce our panellists. First on my left, we've got Dr. Rebecca Kiddle. Rebecca is the director of Te Manawa Haukura, the Centre of Rangahau Excellence at Te Wānanga o Aotearoa. She's been an academic in the fields of architecture, environmental studies and urban design in New Zealand, China and the UK for the past 10 years. Her work's focused on Maori identity and placemaking in Aotearoa and the nexus between creating communities, social processes and urban design. Next we have Te Ari Prendergast, and Te Ari is the design lead at Āhuarangi Architecture. Specialising in authentic, culturally appropriate designs consistent with iwi values. He sees all projects as an opportunity to heal trauma in the land, with the regeneration of the environment being one and the same with the transformation of Indigenous communities. And then down on the end, we've got Dr. Santika Manakara, and she is a senior lecturer of civil and environmental engineering at the University of Auckland. Her research focuses on climate change adaptation, resilience, pre-disaster planning, post-disaster recovery, and the concept building back better. So we'll have some time for some questions at the end, but we have a good list of questions to talk about. Before we get into those, we should hear a bit more about your work. So let's start with Rebecca. Tell us a bit about what you do day to day.
Okay, kia ora koutou, nei rā te mihi kia koutou tēnei pō. No Ngāti Porou me Ngāpuhi. I guess I've only been in the new job about a week and a half, so I can't talk too much about that. But just before that, I was Head of Urban Development out at Hutt City Council, so hoping to reflect a little bit on that, just making sure there's no one from Hutt City Council in the room. And then, and before that at Vic. But I guess I'm really interested in how do we, the work I've done has really been around decolonising cities. What does that mean? And that kind of resulted in a book called Imagining Decolonisation, which came out a couple of years ago. And that really was kind of working across disciplines, because it seems to me that it's very hard for one particular discipline to solve all the problems. So you've got to work across. So yeah, kia ora.
Great, okay. Te Ari, your turn.
Kia ora everyone. Tuatai ka mihi ki a koe mili I tīmata tomato nei hui te karakia I hoakina te arai hei hikoi hei kōrero mā mātou. Nā reira tēnā koe. Huri no I te whare ko tai mai. Ka nui te mihi. Ko te ari tōku ingoa no naitau te whānau apanui. So kia ora everyone. My name is Te Ari. I'm with Āhuarangi. And I thought this question is quite interesting, because I do debate it within myself. What do I do and what label do I use? And so I googled what is an architect. And architect basically is someone who bosses around the masons. So Aki, the boss, and Tech is the mason. And I don't know any masons, and I've never had to boss any masons, so that's not me. And then I looked at some kupu Maori, you know, and we talk about whaihanga. And te whai is to search, you know, and hanga. So I like that as in the process of architecture, the process of building, you know, the emphasis being on the process. Then there are other words, mahi toi being the epitome, the pinnacle. So striving for the pinnacle of what we do. Tauira is to be the example, to be a tauira. Tārai is a sculptor to fashion, and tātai is about precision and mathematics, and so I love our reo, and I love that we can kind of draw on these things, and also we were just talking before, and much of what we do is not architecture. It's about community building, relationship building, looking after people, karakia, mihi, and then sometimes we pick up a pen and we draw. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's something in there, and I like the conversation.
It's great. You summed it up well. Santika, what do you do day to day? Did you Google your job title?
Well, maybe I should. That's a good tip. At the moment, I'm a lecturer, so that's what I do, but I come from a structural engineering background. I worked as a structural engineer looking at multi-story building design. However, I got quite interested in, especially with all the major disasters occurring around the world, and I actually happened to be in Sri Lanka on holiday when the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami disaster struck. So that really, inspired me to kind of understand how communities can recover successfully after disasters. So I sort of changed my career path and got into research, and I started looking at what is successful recovery. And so I basically made it my mission to understand this concept of building back better. What is it? How do you actually do it? And in that process, what eventually happened was the need to really reconceptualize that concept of building back better, take it away from just an engineering-focused thing, and as Becky said, it is multidisciplinary. Everything we do as engineers is really for people, it's for the community, so if we remove that people element, we are not really doing our full service. So my work involved developing a new definition of building back better, a holistic definition, developed a framework for that and a tool that practitioners can now use, and also published that in a book as well. So I'm really all about expanding our role as engineers to consider social, economic, cultural, psychological aspects of communities. And working in the disaster space, it was inevitable. I had to understand climate change. I had to, it was undeniable. And so now a lot of the work I do is also in adapting to climate change and, again, figuring out how to actually reconceptualize it so that it is actually effective. So my day-to-day work is lots of research in all of these areas and also teaching. So we've just started some climate courses at the university and disaster risk management and things like that. So
Great. Well, that segues nicely into our first discussion point. So Santika, we can start with you if you like, since you're on a roll. How can things like architecture, engineering and urban design actually reduce our carbon emissions and make us more sustainable?
So I'll speak about engineering. Engineering itself, so I'm actually a civil engineer, structural engineer, which is even more narrow. Engineering itself is a vast, field, a discipline, and the way I like to think about it, and sometimes we go to schools and talk about what engineering is, and basically everything the light touches is engineering. That's how we sort of tell the kids, If you think of every aspect of your life, you'll see there's some sort of engineering in it, from food to anything else. So broadly speaking, if we start to look at where these emissions are coming from in the engineering industry or discipline, it's from our sources of fuel, so the use of fossil fuels for any of those activities, and then secondly, any emissions that are coming out of any of those activities. So if I then narrow it down to sort of what I know, which is the building industry, the main ways we can cut down on these emissions is firstly trying to minimize the amount of energy needed for all of those processes, so that if it is fossil fuels that we're using less of it. And then secondly, actually adopting cleaner fuel sources. And then thirdly, looking at where these emissions are coming from in any of those processes in a life cycle of a building, from sourcing your materials to processing to constructing to using a building to demolition. So looking at all those stages and kind of cleaning all of that up. So yeah.
Cool, okay. And then jumping, I guess, further back in the process to the architecture point, how do you know, what do we need to do differently with architecture to reduce those emissions and make cities more sustainable?
I might jump back wider.
Yeah, go for it. Jump in where you like.
Because I think what triggered me with that question is that more sustainable, and I think what we lack is the goalpost for what that means, what is sustainable, and then therefore what is more sustainable. If you look at lockdown, you know, the world stopped for 6+ months, and we saw a 6 to 10% drop in emissions in 2020. Versus, so like if our target is 50% by 2030, which I think is the Paris Accord, we're very far, and like the world stopped and we couldn't get to 50. But in a study last year, I was trying to fact check myself, but it's not like the emissions trend is the curve's flattening, so we're getting less bad. You know what I mean? So, which is good. It shows that the little things, the everyday little things, changes that people are making, is having a difference, which is more sustainable. But it's so far off the targets we need to get. So I think it's about being really clear on where the goalpost is and how far we are to that goalpost.
And do you think the means we have at the moment are enough to get us, let's say that goalpost is 50%. In your experience, do you think we've got the technology and things like architecture and building cities to get there and we're just not using them, or do we just not have the ability?
We've got the technology, the know-how. We have 10 years to get to 2030, and we're not going to be able to implement enough of that in time. We're not going to be able to plant enough trees for those trees to grow in that time. So I think that's scary. Like, the direct capture technology is not advanced enough. It's so I think that's what I mean. Like if that's the goalpost, and we're talking about more sustainable, then we're so far off it. And it's kind of scary. But we needed to start a lot earlier, I guess, is the thing.
Yeah. So other than a time machine, Rebecca, do you have any thoughts for us?
Yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah, I guess just to kind of build on what both Santika and Charlie have said. I mean, I guess the standard response from urban designers is we need to live more compactly. We need to create. There's lots of talk about sponge cities at the moment. All that kind of stuff, and it's all great, like great stuff. The more compact we live, the more walkable cities become, the less carbon emissions we're emitting or creating. But I guess for me, there's a kind of systems problem too. That all of this is kind of nested in a kind of capitalist system. Hate to get down this track, but it, this sort of neoliberal overlay on everything means that it's so hard to make these big changes that Te Are's talking about, because everything's kind of dependent on the kind of broader neoliberal system being okay with it. And I think that for me is really problematic. I think any discussion of carbon emissions necessarily has to be teamed up with a discussion of justice, social justice, cultural justice. You know, I've heard so many climate academics say, oh, you know, if we just would walk more, you know, if people would buy their electric cars and their electric bikes. And of course the policy tools are all, you know, we've actually just bought an electric car because we got a $4,000 rebate or whatever. And the policy tools are all kind of pushing us to do those things, but they're not tools for the poor, you know. And I guess that's what worries me, is that we're sort of academics, it feels like, I'm being grossly general here, it feels like are still kind of couching these climate change discussions in what we should do and shouldn't do without this kind of overlay of understanding the kind of social and cultural justice that sits underneath it all, which has a huge impact on how people can actually respond.
Yeah, definitely. And that brings us to the next question quite nicely as well. What challenges does the building industry face in trying to become more sustainable and resilient? You already sort of mentioned, you know, trying to fit this into an idea of a capitalist society is difficult. Is there anything else that you think it faces in trying to be better and build denser cities, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, if I can kind of build on that a bit with a sort of example. So I don't think there's anyone from Hutt City in the audience, but just raise your hand if you... Yeah. So my recent job involved, slightly weirdly, looking after the engineers. So I had the engineering team in my team, and they were tasked with looking at resource consents that came in to subdivide land, you know, to put on multiple units. And the developers were right up there, right keen to intensify the city because it was a moneymaker, right? And who can blame them? That's how the system works. But when the engineers and I talked a lot about kaitiaki. You know, how as an engineer do you be a good kaitiaki in this context? Given Te Āhuarangi, Hutt City is basically a floodplain, you know, and the district plan actually is not, the way that district plans are set up, are not actually set up in a way that disallows people to build where they shouldn't actually build. Easily. So the planners are all, you know, you might not think this, but actually planners are all on board with stopping developers building on floodplains. But the tools available to them are not appropriate, and they don't allow that stopping, disallowing, I don't know if these are English words, but anyway, disallowing of development. And so the engineers would push back and they'd say, look, you can't build on this because it's a floodplain. So the developers say, oh, we'll just put in another metre of infill, we'll build our development a metre up, but of course what happens then, it displaces all the water to the places around it. So there was this ongoing, and there was a point at which the engineers had no ability to push back because the neoliberal system said that what developers wanted to do actually kind of mattered more than this kind of kaitiaki frame that engineers were trying to put over this. So I guess that's one example of what the challenges are.
It's really nice to have actual sort of real world examples in this case, because that is literally on our doorstep and that is happening, and we're going to see the effects of that. Te Are, have you got thoughts or another example of that, or if you need me to remind you of the question?
I think I remember. Just building on that, it's I think diversity in materials, I think we are really lacking
in New Zealand in particular, or the world?
New Zealand in particular. I think the world's a lot more diverse. And funny story, I was talking to someone about bringing in Siberian pine prefabs from Russia. beginning of last year.
Not great timing.
Yeah. So, but
Did you ever get them?
we couldn't bring those in because they didn't fit brands categorizing where they were actually better and cheaper and all these sort of things. So that is an issue. I think supply chains around, like, if we are looking at some big infrastructure stuff in New Zealand, some big work around health, education, but so we're going to need a lot of concrete. Australia's doing the exact same thing, but every city in Australia is doing the equivalent of what we think is big. So we're competing against Australia for concrete, steel, and I know forestry is a dirty word at the moment, but like we definitely need to be diversifying and localizing our supply chain. And can I plug Āhuarangi? It's doing I think it's the tallest or biggest apartment building in Tauranga out of timber.
Cool.
Yeah, so shout outs.
Nice. Yeah, no, good points. And also, of course, through COVID, we really noticed those supply chain issues too. So another reason for locally grown, resilient things. Yeah. Santika, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things, it's just how my brain works. I like to just figure out factors and categorize things. And this is an issue that, we have been thinking about. And if I were to categorize what are the main barriers to actually making these changes that we need to make. And as Te Āti mentioned earlier, it's not that we don't know. We do know ways of actually improving resilience and sustainability. But I think, the two of the biggest things that seem obvious is actually cost and time. Making changes, being proactive instead of being reactive to things, thinking long term, all these things need like a real effort in terms of investing resources, money into this and time. And with all the competing priorities that everyone is dealing with, I think it just keeps getting pushed back, and the urgency is it's just difficult to process. I don't know. We've just experienced Cyclone Gabrielle, so those two are, I guess, one of the biggest barriers. Apart from that, regulation, as you mentioned earlier, and then there's the issue of ignorance and denial of the problem, either or. This also, factors into motivation to actually wanting to make changes. And then expertise is a big issue. So the engineering graduates that we're putting out there, so far, until very recently, until last year or so, were not receiving any education on climate change or adaptation. So how are they supposed to go out and try to solve these problems? Yeah, so this is why Canterbury and us, Auckland, we introduced climate courses right from undergrad, and also more specialized courses in postgrad to try and actually educate our graduates when they get out there. And the last thing I also want to mention is buy-in from all different stakeholders. So this is a very tricky conversation, and in order to make change, we do need different types of stakeholders to actually, accept and kind of make the change. And often I think we are having issues where that is not taking place. So I would say, those are the biggest challenges.
Yeah, great. Well, not great, but great answer. Okay, cool. So So we've seen climate change, obviously, ruining cities over the last month. We've had 2, possibly 3 in different regions, extreme weather events, Cyclone Gabrielle, the most recent. It seems like our cities are not built for these events. What can they be doing better? How can all steps in this process be designing cities better to cope with these weather events and what we assume will be an increase in frequency of these? You can go if you like,
I think it's kind of what I was saying before as well, is really moving away from reactive approaches to proactive approaches. And this really involves, first of all, really committing to understand our new risk levels as a result of climate change. And I don't see this occurring everywhere. We have been provided climate change projections from the international scientific community, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. They've produced these reports and models with consensus from scientists around the world who don't agree. They've done the peer-reviewed research, given us scientific evidence on these models and projections that we can use for various emissions pathways. So it gives us scenarios of if we don't make any changes at all, what is the world going to look like? What are our risk levels? If we say cut our emissions by a certain percentage, then what would that look like? So we have all these models that we can use to predict our risk levels. So it's very important that we actually start to use these and understand our revised risk levels, and then really make a thorough effort to review all our infrastructure and identify vulnerabilities against those projected risks as opposed to the ones that we like to use, the ones that have been in our design codes for years.
So do you see a lot of denial of that the most recent science, like the IPCC reports are updated semi-regularly?
Yeah.
Do you see people still, following the rules from the latest standard published in New Zealand rather than the latest science?
Well, the thing is, standards, for standards to actually use those risk levels, revising standards takes time. So there's a lag between regulation that forces you to do something versus the science that's coming out.
Right.
So what we need to do is actually the right thing to do is use the scientific evidence and kind of design according to that, which the standards may not necessarily stipulate at the moment. So, and once you do that, then the third thing is actually committing the resources to actually make the changes. So it is a wide problem. And I also want to mention, I agree, projections are just predictions. So there's that element. It could happen, may not happen, but so far things have been working out as predicted. But there's another kind of concept in the disaster management adaptation space, especially in the disaster management space, we refer to it as unknown unknowns. So how do we plan for risk when we don't exactly know what the risk is? And this actually takes us into new territory of resilience thinking. So how can you kind of improve resilience through especially things like using an infrastructure networks approach. So we definitely saw this in Cyclone Gabrielle, where we have communities that maybe rely on a certain bridge as their kind of main, entry into a community, being kind of destroyed and then having no other way to get in and out. So we need to look at those kinds of vulnerabilities and kind of put systems in place in every aspect to make sure that we're not vulnerable by one thing, so that we actually build resilience in terms of networks. So there's a few things, and then we also have to acknowledge that sort of built environment solutions, we can't rely on built environment solutions alone to save us. So there's a lot of other things that we need to consider. We need to have some tough conversations around, should we live where we live? And these are tough conversations and other ways of building resilience in communities. So, I could go on forever.
I was just thinking these talks always sort of end up with, the solution being tough conversations.
Yeah.
But that's just the reality of climate change, isn't it? Yeah, cool. Tiari, did you have any thoughts on, some of the challenges and I've forgotten what the question was now. Yeah, the challenges of preparing cities for events like we've just seen with Gabrielle.
Sorry, that answer was
Or
really
something else.
Good. The answer was really good. I think just maybe following your last comments around community and I think building into community infrastructure. And I think if you look at Christchurch, Kaikoura, and just recently Hawke's Bay, I just want to shout out our Maori communities who who do just, I call it the pick up a tea towel mentality, where you just walk into a wharekai and you just pick up a tea towel and you just start drying dishes. And I know in Kaikoura, the marae just opened the doors and anyone who needed help came to the marae, and people who turned up were fed, clothed, given places to shelter, and the Red Cross were like, what's going on? Where's the structure? Who's in charge? And it was just like, oh, no one, this is just what we do. And so I think, that's a really beautiful thing about our culture, and I think we're seeing the finest of our people in Hawke's Bay and Gisborne at the moment, but also we've got Matatini going on, you know what I mean? And still, we've got the biggest festival in Maori culture, and it's still revolved around manaki for our people out on the coast. So I think that's a strength of our communities, but how we can harness that power, and I think a lot of people are calling for our marae to be resourced as civil defence, places.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I mean, we've seen time and time again that marae turn out to be, a port in a storm, literally. Yeah, okay, cool. Rebecca?
I wrote down here, don't build on floodplains, was my answer.
There seems to be something you've really taken from that job. Good advice.
But I guess one other thought, again, using the hut as an example, where there's millions of dollars going into infrastructure out there, cycleways around the harbour, which will be beautiful, lovely.
Beautiful and so contentious.
But I guess, I worry that that we're kind of putting money in slightly the wrong places. There's this ongoing kind of tension, right? Like you're wanting to encourage cycle travel to reduce carbon emissions, but you're building infrastructure that's incredibly vulnerable around a harbour. I don't have the answer for how you fix that, but I don't think we're even having the discussion. That we just go straight to, let's build some new infrastructure. They've just gotten $98 million to build a new water pipe, Three Waters pipe. But all the stuff is still going to Seaview, and all the sewage gets spit out into the harbour, without a discussion around, or what about more local systems for dealing with Three Waters, or sewage and things, sort of block-based systems, or where an urban block might share a sort of there are apparently systems, like in Sweden they use things like bioworks, which kind of collect water within the block and kind of feed out fresh drinkable water, in fact. Cool. But we don't have those discussions. We just go straight to building a big whopping great pipe.
Totally. And I think, adding on to sort of what you were saying there, it's always that sort of tension between protect or retreat, right? And people don't like to have those, again, hard conversations around managed retreat and that kind of stuff. So, there's always going to be money spent. Okay, so next question is, I'll come back to you, Tiari, for this one. This is relating nicely to sort of what you were talking about just before, but how the built environment can help iwi, hapu, whānau achieve their aspirations and address the impacts of climate change at that level?
I think, again, I think that the question, I was wondering around the wording in that, and maybe it is how can Maori communities utilise built environment and all those sort of things better, and I think it's around Maori. I think Maori our communities do have the knowledge, the impetus, and they just lack the power and agency. So it's definitely around supporting and giving them power to make their own decisions. Recently we had our hui a tau at Whanaitahu, and it was discussed around tino rangatiratanga, and we're the only iwi that has tino rangatiratanga written into our settlement. And we were Te Maire Tau was talking about how we need to be doing our own building consents on our own land. You know, like that's where it's getting to is like we're just, because I come from, you know, our pa, but because of the town and country planning that we weren't allowed to build there. And so we had to move to the cities, and we were disconnected from our papakainga. And, you know, so there's legislation that has inhibited our potential, our growth. And I think with Vicky's comment, you know, where Māori land is located, it's usually vulnerable to flooding, erosion, climate change and stuff. So I think that again, I think we need to have a look at these communities and how they are. So I think it's around taking a step back in some ways and not always being the driver in the driving seat and being out pushing the car or however.
So putting the resources in the hands of the people that can use them best, I suppose. Yeah. Rebecca, do you have anything you want to draw on there?
I guess for me, one of the, whenever Māori talk about almost anything, it's kind of done in this wider context, which I think frustrates some people because they just want to know about the particular thing that's happening here. But I think the point of that kind of broader look and that kind of te ao Māori way of looking at the world, that everything is kind of interconnected, humans and non-humans matter, humans and nature matters, blah, 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 is that there's opportunity for co-benefit. So by responding to climate change, there's potential for social justice as well. I'm just madly trying to think of a really good example, but I can't. But I guess, I was going to say something, but it's slightly gone out of my head.
Feel free to launch back in later if it does come back to you as well.
Yeah. Well, I guess that. So I also Googled the answers to the questions before I came here, and I Googled Māori solutions to climate change, and there's nothing online. There's heaps about impacts of climate change on Māori. And again, we've sort of, in other spheres, we've moved away from this kind of deficit approach to policy making, where we're always kind of looking at the kind of the damage to Māori or the damage on Māori and but we're not investing enough time into understanding Māori ways or thinking or Mataranga that could be helping to solve climate change problems. So if anyone wants to invest in that, just give me an email and at Tuanangoro or Aotearoa, we will do the project for you. But the point being that I think that a Māori worldview that looks at the interconnectivity of things is super important for getting outcomes that are, yes, they're good for the climate, but they're also good for people and they're also good for non-humans and blah, 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 blah.
That again, you guys are great at this. That segues into the next question, which is, it's almost like we wrote these in like a normal, flowing order. It's really good. Can traditional building techniques and Indigenous knowledge be used alongside the latest technology, the research, I guess also what you were saying before, Santika, about taking into account those IPCC numbers rather than the regulations. But how do we also wrap in Indigenous knowledge there? Rebecca, you keep going if you want, because you're on a train of thought there.
Te Ari will know more about this, but I guess the example I was thinking about, well, there's a couple of things, perhaps one slightly less related to building techniques, but and again, you'll know more about this than I do, but I think they're called are they called the black maps, those old Christchurch maps? Where they sort of mapped where, in the 1800s or whatever, they mapped where wetlands and things were.
Oh, okay.
And very clearly, Ngāi Tahu and Hapu didn't put their settlements on the wetlands. And yet that city was designed in Oxford, I think it was, without any understanding of the topography of the nature of that landscape. Slammed on the city when somebody, I can't remember who did it, arrived. And again, you might know more than me. And so you now see that some of that has kind of come out in the way that that we've responded post-earthquake, because the particular areas that are particularly wetland have not been rebuilt on. And if they had taken heed of that Mataranga, perhaps we wouldn't have built on them in the first place. So that's one example where I think Indigenous knowledge can really help. I think the other one actually is from Kiribati. My sister's an architect, did a project with Child Fund a few years ago in Kiribati, and we talked to local rangatahi or Kiribati youth, and everyone, all the adults were like, oh, everyone's going to be wanting this high-tech, modern building. Now, people might question why are we building in Kiribati, but anyway, we'll just leave that to one side for now. But actually, the rangatahi wanted traditional Kiribati architecture.
Really?
And they wanted it because
Cool.
they said, we can get the materials locally, we can sustain ourselves, we can change the materials when we need to, particularly the pandanus, forgotten the material, but the stuff they use for the roofs of the maniaba. And we want that because that's our identity. And all the adults were a bit shocked that these young people kind of wanted to retain that for both sustainability reasons, but also for identity reasons. And so that's currently being built actually by, I think Impact's involved. I won't go into why we're building in Kiribati. That's a story for another time.
You can hit Rebecca up afterwards. That's so interesting, and nice to have an example from outside of New Zealand as well, just to sort of demonstrate that these are issues that are faced all around the world. Tiari, what were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I guess the word traditional, I don't know if there's a Maori word for traditional. I think we've always been adapters and always in a constant state of evolution and evolving and trying new things, and I think that's part of what Mataranga is trialing and testing and seeing what works. And so I think like we were carving with nails as soon as we got nails, and things. So I think Mataranga, there's no distinction between Mataranga and other knowledge systems. I just think they're tools that we can use. And the thing about Mataranga is the value systems and also the purpose and meaning of what you're trying to do. So everything around Mataranga stems from stories. And in those stories is inherent meaning, lessons. And they're guiding you to do things in the correct way. And so that's, I think, if you look at science, I think science often thinks we exist in a vacuum. And we know that science is dictated by capitalism. There are diseases that could be cured, but because it's not financially viable, they're not. So I think the combination of Mataranga I think Mataranga can lead, because we have a lead with direction, and science is a tool for us to achieve the goals that we want to achieve.
Cool. Santika, I'll let you answer this one, and then there's one that I forgot to ask you that I'll jump back to. But yeah, thoughts on this one to start with?
No, 100% agree. And one of the shortfalls, and it's actually something I'm researching at the moment, is the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of our current solutions, especially from engineering, obviously, our engineering solutions to adaptation for local communities and local Indigenous communities. So how do communities actually perceive these great things we come up with? Is it actually fit for purpose? And what research and evidence from around the world shows that climate change impacts are very context specific, and therefore the solutions to these need to be context specific as well. And the cookie cutter solutions that we have sometimes, although they're fit for purpose technically, don't necessarily work in reality because they don't address social, cultural, environmental needs and values of the people, right? So, so with Indigenous knowledge, tangata whenua of many around the world, all these Indigenous cultures, people, they've spent generations living in those areas, connecting with the environment, adapting over time. So there's no better people to know, about things like adaptation, things like really being sensitive to the environment, protecting the environment, thinking about long-term kind of generations in the future than Indigenous people. So there's a huge value in kind of understanding and incorporating those principles into engineering design. So another piece of work leading on from what I said before that we're working on is, engineering does try to, in New Zealand as well, there's some consultations, but they're just so, peripheral and
it's
just
ticking a
not
box
authentic.
sometimes.
Although there are some authentic, but we do need to improve that. So one of the things I'm working on is how can kind of engineering design authentically integrate or acknowledge or, some of those principles of Indigenous knowledge and even local community views and perceptions and needs. And however, there is also this thing, I guess a little kind of issue, or it's not an issue, I can't think of the right word, but that we need to kind of face, which is the extractive nature of kind of Western science coming in and taking some principles from Indigenous knowledge. So I think we have to be really careful about the use of Indigenous knowledge, who is it for, how is it used, sovereignty of that knowledge. So I think there are some tricky areas there as well, although there's absolute great value in integrating the two. So,
yeah. Well, the follow-up question I was going to ask you was, how do we make sure that those environments are serving communities correctly? And you already touched on that, really. It's I guess, is it just as simple as talking to those communities, doing consultation properly, or does there need to be, equal ownership over ideas and partnerships involved in that?
Yeah, I would say it is kind of going towards that equal ownership area, because what we're finding is the kind of consultation that we're doing at the moment, those processes don't necessarily provide the best solution. So we are trying to redefine and understand where does the input need to, at what point does it need to come in, how do you integrate different worldviews, how do you expand kind of this Western science worldview into authentically integrating those other worldviews and needs and things like that. So yeah, I will let you know the answer once I find out.
Sounds good. So I've just been told that we've got about 5 minutes left until we're going to open the floor up for your questions. But the last couple of questions for you guys are sort of more, I don't want to say they're a fun one, but they are fun ones. So, feel free to just riff off these, but are there any sort of inspiring or interesting examples? We already had one from you, Rebecca, with Kiribati, which was really interesting as an outside of Aotearoa sort of example, but Yeah, does anyone else have any sort of ideas that fit this theme that you want to share? All good if you don't, because there's another question afterwards. I hope you're all thinking of questions too. This is some thinking time.
I mean, I do have one, unless I can see his brain working.
Yeah, go for it. Santika, you go first.
So one of the examples, like Rebecca said about Kiribati, I was working in Fiji after Cyclone Winston looking at their recovery. And unfortunately, so Fiji's traditional building structure is the bure, if anyone's familiar or been there. Unfortunately, though, with modernization and everything, majority of that bure design has been abandoned in place of modern home construction. And in the main island of Fiji, Viti Levu, there's only one village that has committed to preserving this traditional building structure. And after Cyclone Winston, which was a very horrendous disaster over there, 90% of the building stock, housing stock was damaged all around, except for the bure structures in this village, Navala. And it was just magical to kind of drive in and see all the houses still standing up. So, and that building structure, so clearly, because Fiji has a history of being exposed to tropical cyclones, it's this traditional knowledge of trial and error that have ended them with that particular way of building, the angles they've used, the materials they've used, and all those, the fixings and everything to be resilient, to be naturally resilient to those cyclones. And there were challenges there because this type of building, the knowledge for how to build that structure is only passed on through generations in certain families that are builders, who are builders. So even the remaining population in Fiji had actually lost that knowledge. So we were looking at ways of trying to develop some guidelines or how to model the bure design and then seeing how this could be incorporated. So it was a great example of that Indigenous knowledge and its resilience, but also a bit of a sad view of what can happen when that knowledge isn't appreciated and retained. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that's another example of ways that, Indigenous knowledge can be supported, is for it to be included in things like advice and official sort of regulations and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Nice. The other question on here is, what is your vision for Aotearoa's built environment? You can be sort of the next 10 years, the next 100 years. Do any of you have like a very specific picture in your mind's eye of what we should be aiming at?
I did a workshop with Ngāti Toa a few years ago, asking them what a Māori street might look like. And it was really fascinating. And for those of you who know Ngāti Toa, they've still got their papakainga that they've had for mai rano, or maybe not mai rano, anyway, for a long time, out in Porirua, Takapuahia, and so they still are living more or less, not quite, but more or less the iwi is kind of, or a big chunk of the iwi is living around the marae in Porirua. And so they talked a lot about they would want streets where kids could play, where you could run to any house and get kai, where you could sort of see your nanny kind of down the street and know that there was lots of safe places to be, and that kind of thing. And they also were talking about having like a Ngāti Toa letterbox that each house would have. So say this is Ngāti Toa territory, which I thought was really cool. But the basic message was we want a place where we feel like we can see ourselves in the street. And there's this mantra that lots of people use, we want to see our faces in these places. But that really rings true for mana whenua for whom the city has grown up around them. So I think, how does that relate to climate change? I think, again, it's this, I think social and cultural justice is inextricably connected to climate justice. So if you don't get this one right, you're never going to get this one right, because climate, you know, it has to be more than the rich people that are able to respond to our climate problems.
Nice.
So yeah, I guess that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, cool.
In
Sounds ideal.
10 years.
Or less. Yeah, cool. Te Ari, any sort of final thoughts? And then we'll move on to questions, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll try to be quick.
That's all right. Take your time.
Just what got me thinking was we've been doing some work in Australia with First Nations, and what a privilege and pleasure it is to sit and learn with them, and I'm quite a novice in that space, but just the concept of country, and I think here, like the built environment, I don't think the word built environment is capturing what we're talking about. And I was thinking around cultural landscape, you know what I mean? I think, but I think we get too hung up on the landscape. So I think something in between, and I like the term around country, and how they explain it, and how it connects from the ground to the sky. You know what I mean? The sky, the stars and the moon and the orientation dictates what is happening on the land, and I just think it's such a beautiful concept. And we talk about whenua, but the idea of my papa ki rangi, you know what I mean? So I think we really need to kind of take a wider look at things. And I've worked on papakainga on the East Coast, and we're looking at specific land blocks that were owned by whānau. And my whānau was literally owned the land block next door, and I'm like, why are we doing this one? Why don't we do the one next door as well while we're here? So it got me thinking, like, we need to do a road trip, and that was my idea back then, was just to get a bunch of engineers and stuff and survey and stuff. But through recent events, I think we need to take that wider and really look at it like a meta-analysis of our Maori land throughout the East Coast, and have ecologists, landscape architects, kaumātua, kuia, the engineers, everyone having a really wide view of land use, and being taking the onus out of the hands of rural people who are dealing with day-to-day stuff, and then being expected to fill out all these forms for TPK and councils and MB. So let's do let's take on that work, because we're all we think we're all the experts. Let's take all the admin out of it and just get into like good guidance for our rural communities on how they can develop with good educated people. To know not to build on that floodplain, but in saying that, knowing that there's a connection to that place. So how come, if living there, having a house there, might not be a good idea? What's another way of maintaining connection to those places?
Yeah, cool. So a wider lens is needed for the whole system.
Yeah, like a
cool.
meta-analysis.
Thanks, guys. Okay, we're going to open it up to questions. So Millie over there's got the microphone, so just raise your hand like we're in class if you have a question. Great, questions.
It's a fast hand.
A very keen question.
If it can be quick too, that would be amazing.
Okay. So, Rebecca, this question is for you. Because I've just moved down to Hutt City from Auckland.
What have you done?
I live in a floodplain. So I guess my question is particular but also general. New Zealand is a modern economy, You know, I come from Greece, which has a lot of problems. I've seen New Zealand as a modern economy. I've worked on climate change since 1990. This is not a first time. Why are we surprised? What is it? I did not understand exactly what it was that stopped people around you in Hutt City or Hutt Central from understanding the idea that this is a floodplain. We're going to have more storms coming, possibly floods. We need to do something about it. What stops people? Who stops this? And I guess, sorry, just to add to what you said before about how we need to start using the scientific projection models to. Who is we, in your opinion? Is it government? Is it building authorities? What's stopping this? It's frustrating.
What's stopping it? Elected representatives. No, although that's kind of true, actually. I'll just be really frank. I think at least in some of the local government things that I've seen, elected representatives are often voted in on a kind of single issue kaupapa. Doesn't tend to be climate change because that's not a vote winner. And so when you get real discussions around climate change and what to do about it, everyone kind of either falls silent or it happens in more nuanced ways. So, for example, developers will argue through the teeth that they are doing this great job for Hutt because we've got this housing problem, right? We've got this housing problem, we need more housing. So come on, consent planners and engineers, hurry up with my resource consent so I can build more houses to solve the housing problem. So there's a kind of, there's a problem of conflicting problems. And it's a very real one. Like, what do? We've got so many people who don't have good housing. The Hutt is being seen as kind of the place where we can build a bit more because Wellington City's a bit full up now. So we kind of, you know, the Wellington Regional kind of growth framework is seeing the Hutt and Upper Hutt and Levin, I think, as the places where you can build much more housing. But it's that whole kind of Wellington region-wide strategy hasn't really taken into account the fact that it's a floodplain. So you're getting kind of pressures from that kind of strategic level, and all the mayors of the Wellington region sit on that Wellington Regional Growth Framework body. You're getting that pressure. You're getting pressures from developers who are saying, we're solving your housing problem for us. Why aren't you giving us our consent as soon as possible? Why are you putting all these obstacles in the way, like making us, you know, not build 1 metre higher and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So, and then you've got elected representatives that either stay quiet or they have the ear of the developer. No, the other way around. The developers have their ears, and so they are saying, come on, consent planners and engineers, what the hell are you doing? Speed up.
Do you think they don't understand climate change? They don't understand it.
I just think people are pretty short-termist. I think they find it hard to think beyond a few years, and then we have last year we had all those slips out there. There were hundreds of them. And so all the transport team was sort of diverted to trying to fix all these slips. And still, everyone's like, yes, we need to be a bit more resilient. But, there's kind of no action. The other thing in the defence of local government is that central government has laid over so many actions, right? We've got local government reform, we've got Three Waters reform, we've got the MPSUD, we've got... can't remember what else, but there's all these kind of big things that are all about, potentially responding to climate change. I'm not sure about local government reform. And local government is actually pretty poor in resources, and having to scramble to keep up, having to constantly review district plans and change plans, and there's hardly any planners because of COVID. There's hardly any engineers because of COVID. And so they're kind of on a hiding to nothing, you know. So I beg local government a bit, but I also feel really sorry for them because they're in this unenviable position of having to respond to local government, central government, without any resource, even though we all know, I mean, GNS is in Lower Hutt, and they're telling us that the foreshore is sinking as well as the sea level's rising. So there's a double whammy going on out there. And still.
We appreciate your frankness, so we know you're not meaning to bag on local government.
No.
Santika, do you want to answer your part of the question as well?
Yeah, well, the good news in that is that at the government level, I mean, I think, you know, we have the National Climate Change Risk Assessment and the National Adaptation Plan they've been released in the past few years that actually give us guidance that this is what we should be doing. We should be following the climate projections, and that guidance is there. The we that I referred to was actually coming from my perspective, which is us engineers. Without our building codes, at the moment they are being updated, but without the building codes, I guess, stipulating or regulating or forcing us to look at these new risk levels, we as engineers have a responsibility to actually take into account these things and start designing using those projections. And the problem there is that these national level documents are a little bit vague, so it just doesn't sometimes translate down to how and why and when should I really implement these things, especially when I talked about those issues, challenges with cost and time, and as you know, engineers, they're working on time frames and budgets and all of that. However, some of my amazing colleagues at Tonkin and Taylor, and together with a few other organizations, have tried to filter this national level information down and created a local guide to climate risk assessment, which is engineer friendly. So hopefully it gives a clear guide on exactly how does an engineer design according to this. However, once again, it's just a guideline. So as I said, if the engineers aren't educated at university, at what point does this training come in? Unless someone goes into engineering firms and upskills them on these things. So this is why, on the one hand, as I said, we're starting to educate our undergrads, but from a kind of engineering professional body level, Engineering New Zealand has actually started a climate action group, and I'm part of the steering committee as well for that, and we're developing some kind of more standards for like best practice standards for engineers to actually implement these things, because they do need to follow Engineering New Zealand guidelines and codes of conduct. So
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, both of you, for answering that question. Have we got any other questions?
Just have one more partai for the night.
I'm sure we'll also be loitering around afterwards if you want to approach me. I don't know anything. These people know things.
I like your idea of getting rid of capitalism. How do you think we do it, and how do we slow it down?
These talks always dissolve into anti-capitalism. Why is that happening?
Sorry, I didn't hear the end of it. I heard the cap. Oh God.
Can I answer that one?
Tiari wants to answer this question, so you go for it.
I'm going to probably be devil's advocate here, but I think what I was saying is we've got a very limited time to make radical change, and system overhaul was just not going to get us there. This is my personal view, and feel free to argue with me, throw me out. So I think we need to make some billionaires, trillionaires to solve climate change.
Do we have any in?
Using capitalism to
I think following, if you look at what has happened in the space race or space, you've got the combination of big business, institutions, academics, and governments. I think China, everyone's at war, but if you look at the space, they're all working together. Russia, US, China, India, everyone's sort of, and from the public point of view, everyone's like, cool, let's go to Mars. Like it's, we
solve
talk
a lot of
about
problems like that.
the branding of climate change. No one understands it, but going to Mars, I get that, I can get behind that. So my theory is we should be co-opting the space race to benefit climate change.
Cool.
Yeah, throw me out if you like. I don't know.
I just wanted to add, isn't the space race basically saying, let's find a planet B because we've really messed this up, right? I mean, they're trying to find other possible
Ironic,
settlements. So it's just awful.
Well, no, I think send them to Mars. Like,
Send
that
them.
answer
go
your
mine
question?
in Mars. You can do whatever you want. Go mine asteroids. Earth is we've got finite resources, but space is infinite. So let's go for it. I mean, again, throw me off the balcony if you like.
Fantastic. And on that note, Melly?
Kia ora, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. It's been really nice to see you all, and this is a series that we do here at Te Papa, so this is the third iteration of panel discussions in this series, so keep an eye out for future ones. They'll continue to be happening in the future, so keep an eye out on our social media and on our website. So kia ora, thank you for being here tonight everyone. If we can